With the release of the new consoles late last year, there were a few games that we didn't get a chance to cover at time of release, and Doom Eternal for Nintendo's Switch is one such game. Now, the situation behind this one is certainly curious then. Having shipped earlier in the year on other platforms, Panic Button continued to work on the Switch version of Doom Eternal quietly in the background. It finally arrived in December as a digital-only release, and we're finally here to discuss it. So today, we'll check out the game running in portable and docked modes, compare it against the other console version, examine performance numbers, and discuss what it means to port a game like this during this era. So, let's get started. There's no question about it, Doom Eternal is a remarkably impressive technical achievement. The idTech 7 engine delivers exceptionally high quality visuals at a smooth 60 frames per second across the full range of PlayStation and Xbox consoles. We witnessed a huge boost in texture quality, geometry density, and world scale. It's a game that truly demonstrates the full potential of these machines at the end of the generation. But the Switch, that's an entirely different thing. This is a good time to clarify things then. When discussing ports of games to different platforms, the final judgment must always consider the target hardware. The Switch is a mobile game system drawing extraordinarily little power from your wall outlet. It was never going to match the other platforms. But that does not preclude the final product from stoking our interest. In fact, it calls to mind classic ports such as Quake for the Sega Saturn, a true high watermark for ports to less capable machines. The Sega Saturn was never going to run the original version of the game in question, Quake. Based on what we know, I might describe it as impossible. Yet the developer managed to find a way to make it work. It's certainly not perfect. The frame rate is relatively low, and it's challenging to play on the Saturn gamepad. But it's still remarkable to see either way. I can praise this port knowing full well that it's not really up to par with that PC original. And that's the key here. One can find such a port impressive and interesting while still acknowledging its shortcomings. Make no bones about it, Doom Eternal for the Switch is the worst way to play Doom Eternal, but it's also a huge technical accomplishment. It is in fact both of these things and more. Now, from my perspective, the focus of a port like this should always center around recreating as many key aspects of the game in question while making intelligent cuts. Even with a reduction in visual quality, the game should retain its visual identity while offering performance characteristics that avoid spoiling the fun, shall we say. If your port exhibits painfully long loading times, poor performance, and a huge reduction in visual quality, it's unlikely to be a game you will enjoy playing. I would describe this as a poor conversion. Doom Eternal for the Switch is not a poor conversion. Okay, so with its previous ports, I feel that Panic Button, the developer of this conversion, has done excellent work in achieving these objectives. Doom 2016 and the various WOLFENSTEIN titles all very clearly deliver the gameplay and visual signature of the original games, albeit at a lower resolution and frame rate. However, each port still exhibited various flaws, including bad frame pacing, slowdown, and other such things. With Doom Eternal now standing as a more technically ambitious game than any of the previously mentioned titles, I was pleasantly surprised with how well it fares in comparison. The average resolution, for instance, is still comparable to Doom 2016 despite the increase in visual complexity. In fact, it retains a higher pixel count than Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, ever could. In docked mode, the game maxes out at 720p, just like those older titles, but it does dip to just below 540p when taxed. In comparison, Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus on the Nintendo Switch, dropped as low as 360p when docked, so it's an improvement. In portable mode then, 360p becomes a possibility, while somewhere around 600p seems to be the ceiling. In 2021, these low pixel counts are indeed starting to feel somewhat incompatible with modern displays, I might say. So, in terms of image quality, Doom Eternal makes the expected cuts given the platform. But now allow me to draw comparisons against one of its bigger brothers. For this critical comparison then, I've opted to utilize the Xbox One version of the game running on Xbox One X. My reason for selecting this version is as simple as it was the one console version I still had installed. You see, for my personal playthrough, I opted to spend my time on the PC. As with any comparison, I spent time during capture jumping back and forth to create the shots that you see here. I'd play a section of the game on the Switch, then using that footage as a reference would repeat those same actions on the Xbox. In doing so, I found my opinion waffling back and forth. Yes, the sacrifices were certainly clear, and I'll discuss those in detail momentarily. But in the small video playback window on my desktop that I used for making comparisons, there was little doubt that the Switch version successfully captured the look of Doom Eternal. You can see it for yourself. The overall scene complexity, the lighting, and effects, they're mostly intact. Yes, it's blurry as a result of the lower rendering resolution, of course, but it's unmistakably Doom Eternal. This comes back to intelligent cuts. Panic Button needed to find a way to replicate the look of the original game within the constraints of its platform. It's the need for such creative changes that I find most engaging when analyzing a port such as this. So, what has changed then? Well, aside from the resolution, the most significant departure lies in the texture detail. Basically, with idTech 7, id finally left behind the remnants of megatexture, embracing more tried and true methods. To put it simply, this allows for greater high-frequency detail at close proximity. It's the reason why the textures are so much sharper in Doom Eternal compared to the prior Doom release. The downside to this, of course, is that the Switch itself just doesn't have the memory to support this approach without sacrificing asset quality, and that's precisely what's happened here. Texture resolution is reduced throughout, leading to less nuanced surfaces with more visible bilinear texture blur. Of course, this doesn't seem to be a simple across-the-board change here. The drop in detail is very selective, and certain objects look much sharper than others. The most commonly viewed textures retain a higher resolution appearance, while the smaller flourishes are now much blurrier on Switch. So this is the first major change to the visual quality. Now, another loss from my perspective at least is the complete elimination of per-object motion blur and other post-processing effects such as the bokeh depth of field that the game uses at various scenes. This is perhaps the most significant cut, as these elements not only help offset the reduced frame rate, but play a key role in defining the look of Doom Eternal. Without these effects, which were present in prior panic button conversions, the game winds up looking somewhat less impressive in motion. You'll also miss the depth of field when performing a glory kill, something which really highlighted and focused the player's attention specifically on the creature being ripped apart. Other changes includes more aggressive LODs in certain areas and lower precision volumetric effects. It also seems like the particles have been reduced somewhat on Switch. But then there's this strange issue here, and yes, there are fewer particles on the Switch side in this scene as well, but look at these vertical lines. I think this is an artifact of the dynamic resolution scaling system here. There's some sort of fine pattern that is getting caught up in the way the game is being rendered. I'm reminded of adjusting the clock and phase on an OSSC and not quite getting the settings correct. It's a very strange thing. But despite all this, the density and complexity of the maps themselves has been retained. Considering the sheer volume of geometry on display and the size of the map data, this is a remarkable achievement. It also ensures that the entirety of the game itself is fully intact. Beyond this, the animation quality has also remained, so enemy movements are very fluid, as are the weapon animations, not to mention the alembic animation used in certain sequences. So perhaps now you can sort of understand why my opinion on the conversion quality sort of flip-flops during testing. It swings between extremely impressive and noticeably less attractive depending on where you point the camera. So how do you judge something like this? I mean, it doesn't look like the other console versions, but at the same time, it never would. It's all about those, again, intelligent cuts. And in that sense, I feel that the team made the right call in most places. The careful reduction in texture quality, for instance, is a given here, and I feel they did a good job at placing detail where it needs to be while reducing it in more strategic points. I also appreciate that the map complexity is fully intact. Above all else, however, the Doom Eternal aesthetic has been fully achieved on Switch. It is visually superior to the prior Wolfenstein ports overall, I'd argue. The sacrifices made here are less distracting, and it more closely matches the original console release. Really, the only major critique and decision that I sort of disagree with is the elimination of the post-processing effects. With motion blur restored, at the very least, the quality of the visuals would benefit tremendously. Of course, these effects are not free, they have their own fixed cost, so I can imagine that the decision to remove them was not made lightly. It's likely that the Switch is bottlenecked in a way that makes adding these effects back into the mix extremely difficult. The thing is, when we shift over to performance discussion, the true victory becomes clear. Now, as a reminder, Doom 2016 on the Switch exhibits minor dips with significant frame pacing errors that reduce the overall fluidity of the game. Wolfenstein 2 also suffers from serious performance drops in some of the game's larger battles. Miraculously, Doom Eternal outperforms all prior idTech ports to the Switch. The target frame rate is of course reduced to 30 frames per second, as expected for the hardware, but unlike prior releases, Doom Eternal maintains this frame rate most of the time.
Help to make our friends transition.
I played through roughly half of the game's missions on Switch for this video. In doing so, I only really found one area which exhibited any noticeable dips at all, and this is that area. As you can see, these drops in performance, while visible, aren't severe enough to drag down the experience. It's much smoother than Wolfenstein 2, for instance. So yeah, docked mode, it's solid overall and demonstrates key improvements to the overall optimization of Panic Button's idTech conversions. It seems like a great candidate for an upgrade if a Switch Pro ever happens, however. But of course, there's more to the Switch than the docked performance. How does it stack up in portable mode? Well, in this case, I wasn't able to test the same levels as I made the mistake of playing primarily on my primary Switch. The portable capture switch had to start from the beginning of the game. Still, we can glean a lot of information just from playing the very first mission. So it's not bad. The average performance is somewhat comparable to the docked mode, but I noted an increase in frame persistency errors. Bad frame pacing, essentially. This is an issue which plagued the other Panic Button conversions to Switch. It's perhaps not quite that severe, but it definitely rears its head more often in portable mode than it does in docked mode. Despite this issue, however, it's generally solid overall, and the game does seem to hang around 30 FPS. But there's one major caveat that I need to discuss, and that is the cutscenes. Essentially, cutscenes in portable mode are capped at 20 frames per second, with bad frame pacing. This is on top of the fact that all cutscenes are now letterboxed in this version of the game, whereas in the original incarnation of Doom Eternal, they fill the screen. Thus, they really don't look or run especially well in portable mode. This is perhaps the biggest issue. But still, while actually playing the game itself, things really aren't bad. But I do have one little nitpick I'd like to discuss, the game's login screen. Here's the thing, when you first launch Doom Eternal, you're required to log in to a Bethesda account. It's like this in the other versions of the game as well. This wasn't an issue on my main Switch as I had logged in before. However, when it came time to capture portable footage of the game, I ran into a problem. The account on which Doom Eternal was redeemed is not the primary account on this Switch, and as such I couldn't begin the game in offline mode to bypass it. As a result of this configuration and the fact that the Bethesda account was linked to another Nintendo ID, I wasn't able to log in at all. I tried to create a new account then, but it turns out I had used all of my available email accounts to do the same thing prior. It's not an account I use often, however, so I didn't remember the username and or password. The solution, Will Judd suggested adding a plus sign with additional text after my primary email account to quote-unquote trick the system. And it worked. The confirmation email arrived in my primary email box and I was able to continue. Publishers, I get it. I understand the draw of cultivating your own ecosystem here, but please, in the future, make these screens optional. But okay, let's breathe. With that out of the way, let's get to the wrap-up. What's the takeaway here overall? Well, it's an interesting situation for sure. When we discuss Switch ports, inevitably, there's a group of people that don't fully understand the conclusion drawn, but it's really quite simple. You see, the Switch simply isn't comparable to the last generation of consoles in terms of performance due to its portable nature. This is not a PS4 or Xbox One replacement. But whether we're talking about Switch or something else, when judging ports to any platform, the difference between the original and target platforms must be defined and understood. Which is why I believe Doom Eternal on Switch is generally an excellent conversion. In fact, it's some of the finest work Panic Button has done to date. It exhibits many of the same sacrifices we saw in their previous works, but offers a considerably smoother frame rate. The fact that it delivers a near-locked 30 frames per second experience versus the unstable results in those prior games is a huge achievement indeed. If you judge this game based on what the Switch is capable of, it all makes sense. You must go in with these caveats in mind and understand that this is Doom Eternal running on a portable system. It's not comparable to its bigger brothers in terms of performance or visual quality, sure, but it gets surprisingly close and it plays extremely well as a portable game. So while I have my nitpicks here and there, such as the elimination of post-processing effects and that login screen, overall, the work here is superlative. But that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like and subscribe and ring the notification bell, as well as find us over on Twitter if you want to discuss the game. We'll be back with much more coverage over the coming days and weeks, so stay tuned to Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next time.